Ah, the Ottoman Empire. Inspiration for Orientalist fantasists for generations. Land of ostentatious hats. Inventor of the Ottoman. Now you might be asking yourself, why? Why the Ottoman Empire? Well, let me show you why. This is a diagram of the length of empires. Here's the Ottoman Empire. As you can see, it lasted 600 years. Now you might be saying, well, Typhon, 600 years, yeah, that's a long time, but look over here at China. That lasted almost 2 millennia. And over here at the Byzantine Empire, that lasted over a millennia. 6 centuries compared to that, isn't that great? Well, there's something sort of special about the Ottoman Empire. And if you look at these horizontal white bars, these horizontal white bars represent regime changes. Now, there may have been empires that lasted longer than the Ottoman Empire, but not without regime changes. In fact, the only empire that even comes close to 600 years of the Ottoman Empire without a regime change is the Han Dynasty in China, which lasted 400 years. So how did the Ottoman Empire manage this? How did they manage to last 600 years without a regime change? Murad I, the first Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was getting really nervous. And what was making him nervous? The increasing power of the Turkish nobility. So to counter the increasing power of the Turkish nobility, Murad created the Janissaries. And the Janissaries were essentially his own private military group, separate from the standing army of the Ottoman Empire. And over time, these Janissaries ended up taking over more than just military positions within the Ottoman Empire. They became the chief administrators, the viziers, even the Grand Vizier. They were the scientists, the engineers, the architects. In fact, over time, the Janissaries became the majority of the ruling class of the Ottoman Empire. But here's the thing. The Janissaries were the sons of Christian slaves who had been taken from their families and forcibly converted to Islam between the ages of about 7 to 10. Why would Murad I choose a bunch of Christian slaves to rule his empire rather than people who were part of his own ethnicity, his own culture, his own class, and his own religion? Let's look at what makes the Turkish nobility threatening to the Sultan. Their identities were granted by the same authority the Sultan's was, by birth. The Sultan therefore had no control over their identities. When you have, as the Turkish nobles did, a positive identity based on something innate to you, you can conceptualize the world in terms of benefit to that innate identity. An innate identity affords a sense of vulnerability. On the most basic level, a person whose vulnerabilities are integrated into their sense of self grants themselves the right to judge others based on those vulnerabilities. The Turkish nobility can serve the Sultan out of loyalty, duty, or self-interest, but because of their vulnerability, they retained an independence of character that allowed them to judge the Sultan based on their own benefit. The Turkish nobility's vulnerability thus was the most powerful weapon of sedition in their arsenal. Because vulnerability was integrated into their identities, they could perceive the bad intent and agency of the Sultan. They could establish threat narratives, both personally and politically. They could weaponize their vulnerability to create a threat narrative against the Sultan. What the Sultan needed to rule his empire for him was a group of people that couldn't perceive their own vulnerabilities. But why Christian slaves? You'd think that slaves, Christian slaves in a Muslim society no less, would have the greatest feelings of persecution, that their vulnerability stat would be the most sensitive, thus the most dangerous to the Sultan. And if you thought that, you'd be absolutely wrong. So, to discover the answer to this question, let's look at how the Janissaries were recruited and raised. They were first stripped from their birth families, forced to march 500 miles to weed out the weak ones, and then forcibly converted to Islam. This entire process of stripping them from their homes and culture and families and inducting them into a group they could never truly be part of created a permanent sense of shame and alienation. Alienation from a group they wanted to be part of, namely the Muslims, but never really truly can, and shame for those parts of themselves that mark them as different and separate, their previous existence as the sons of Christian slaves. Being branded by shame strips the Janissaries of innate positive identity. You remember that innate positive identity the Turkish nobles had? Well, the Janissaries didn't. Instead, they had a driving need to prove that they belonged to their new group. Now they must earn an identity through their actions in service of some outside goal. Enter the Sultan's threat narrative. When you no longer have an innate positive identity, an innate positive social identity, you're compelled through shame to take your positive identity through your actions and ambitions in service to someone else's threat narrative. You lose the ability to acknowledge your own vulnerabilities. Your vulnerabilities are placed in opposition to the very source of your identity, your ability to serve. Because you can't acknowledge your vulnerabilities, they become recast as personal failures. They become shame. These ruling slaves may refer to any mention of their vulnerabilities as whining, or being a pussy. Slave up, they might say. Further, any negative action taken by the Sultan against the Janissaries is always justified, because the Janissaries are judged and judge themselves solely by his benefit. If he takes negative action against them, they must have failed him somehow. So when the Sultan did anything aggressive or violent towards the Janissaries, the question would be, what did they do to deserve it? Oppression by the Sultan is thus transformed into the Janissaries' own failure, and the Janissaries' vulnerabilities are no longer part of their identity. And because their vulnerabilities are no longer part of their identity, they cannot judge the bad intent or agency of the Sultan. If you've been following along with my threat narrative videos, this particular bar should be fairly familiar to you. As you can see, the Sultan has set it up so that his vulnerabilities define the Janissaries' identity. When the Janissary is useful to the Sultan's vulnerabilities, he has a positive identity as a hero. When the Janissary can't do anything to help the Sultan's vulnerabilities, he's either a villain or incompetent, the incompetent idiot. Now this bar represents the outward manifestation of the Janissary's identity. Let's look closer at the inside workings to understand why the Janissary has come to identify with the Sultan's threat narrative so deeply. Shame has branded him, and he seeks to mask the pain through achievement within the context of the Sultan's threat narrative. But because he cannot escape his branding, the pressure of shame remains, constantly rebuilding. He becomes identified with his service to a system, because service to the system is the only way for him, at least the only way he believes, to ease his shame. The deeper the branding, the more the Janissary desires achievement within the system to ease the pain of shame. Ambition and addiction to outside validation are symptoms of deeply rooted shame. The Janissary's sense of self is so tied to serving the Sultan's threat narrative that he cannot see his own subjugation. To question his subjugation is to question the very basis of his own self-value. And if anyone else questions his service of this system, even the involuntary nature of him being torn from his Christian family to begin with, he would be the first to condemn them. For him, rejecting this grafted identity is the hardest task imaginable. It's worse than dying. The only way to break the cycle is for the Janissary to question the system that he thinks will provide him enough pride to feed his shame-based hunger. Yet without that system, the Janissary feels he will be lost to shame, even though the system created the shame in the first place. The Sultan has set up a cycle of addiction in the Janissary with himself as the drug dealer. In fact, the Janissary needs the Sultan to create a threat narrative for him to serve, just as much as the Sultan needs the Janissary to rule on the Sultan's behalf. And while the Janissary actively denies and represses his own vulnerability in order to serve the Sultan, he can't generate a threat narrative against the Sultan. In fact, he cannot even conceive of his vulnerabilities to the Sultan. He has no identity without the Sultan, and the Sultan has no power without him. They are, in effect, one being. In the Janissaries, the Sultans of the Ottoman Empire rebuilt human minds into machines to serve. That the Janissaries ruled wasn't evidence of their power, but how deeply and profoundly they had been broken to the Sultan's will. This system would have been invisible to the people in it. If you asked the Turkish nobles who ruled, they would have said the Janissaries ruled. They might even speak of how they were oppressed by these slaves, how these slaves unfairly monopolized the jobs and prestigious positions, how these slaves used their power to benefit themselves, how there existed a wage gap that allowed slaves to accrue greater wealth than the Turkish nobility, how in an equitable society the majority of the positions of prominence wouldn't go to Janissaries. If you pointed out the greater death rate of Janissaries in wars, the nobles might counter by saying, "They're killed by other Christians, so it doesn't count," or, "If there weren't infidels, we wouldn't need a bunch of converted infidels to kill them in the first place." If you asked the Janissaries if they were slaves, they probably would have scoffed and said, "We're the soldiers, the architects, the engineers, the scribes, the administration, the generals, even the Grand fucking Vizier. No way are we slaves." If you asked the Sultan, he probably would have smiled coyly and said, "I would be lost without my Janissaries." The only way to see the slavery inherent in the system would be to understand how shame creates slaves with no identity outside of serving someone else's threat narrative. By being branded with shame, the Janissaries were turned into human machines to serve the Sultan's will. They no more ruled the Ottoman Empire than a traffic light rules an intersection. The most useful slave is a slave who is even more powerful than you, but defines himself by your benefit. But how do you create a slave that serves you even when he has the power to destroy you? You have to turn him into an extension of yourself. Your threat narrative has to become his. In the Ottoman Empire's Janissaries we find the practice of slavery nearly perfected. But could the practice of slavery be made even better? The Ottoman Empire lasted for 6 centuries without a single regime change. That's unprecedented in history, at least as far as we know. But is it possible that there exists an even more vast, powerful, and long-lived empire that used a system very much like the Janissaries to last all of recorded history?